Welcome, welcome, welcome today to our monthly Tiger Bay meeting. We are so glad that you can be here. I know we're probably going to have a few stragglers coming in, as I'm told there's quite a bit of traffic out there. Who would imagine that there's a lot of traffic in Manatee County at the first week of spring training season? Programming committee, please make note, maybe we need to schedule a meeting on traffic soon, because maybe we haven't beaten that one to death enough already. Again, everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We hope you enjoy the program we've put together for you today. We think it is extremely educational and very engaging, and we hope that all of you will leave here today more enriched and with a greater knowledge of the subject than you came in with. Before we get started, I would appreciate it if we could all stand and say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I think we've got a lot of ground to cover today, so forgive me, I just kind of want to dig right in and get started today. As you know, the United States is a land of immigrants. For centuries, our country has been seen as a land of opportunity, free of political and religious persecution, and by and large, we have welcomed those who seek a better life in our country. Now, though, we face a great debate regarding the acceptance of the homeless, tempest-tossed refugees from Syria. Our president has said that the U.S. will follow its moral imperative and accept thousands of such refugees, while more than half of the states in the Union have said that they will not accept those same refugees. There are arguments on both sides, but what is the best way to handle the Syrian refugee crisis? Today, we hope to delve into that topic a little deeper than the headlines seen on the evening news and get both a more personal view from each side of the issue, as well as some cold, hard facts about what the actual laws are, what the true numbers are, and how we got here today. Our first speaker today is Thomas Goldman. Thomas Goldman has practiced and taught law for 48 years, with the last 13 years devoted entirely to immigration law. A graduate of the University of Mississippi with a Juris Doctor degree and New York University with a Master of Laws degree, he taught at the University of Tulsa, Southern Methodist University, and served as the Associate Dean of Mississippi College of Law. He has handled asylum and removal cases in Florida, Puerto Rico, Michigan, and Louisiana. Currently, his law firm has offices in several Florida cities, but his main office is right here in Bradenton. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Thomas Goldman.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today to talk about the law related to refugees. The President has the authority to send refugees to the state of Florida and to other states based on basically three laws. First of all, international law. Secondly, the Refugee Act of 1980. And thirdly, the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Now, in 1941, the United Nations adopted the Convention on Refugees, and the United States became a part of that. And after that signing of that agreement, we have taken in refugees every year. In fact, we take in more than most countries take in. At the present time, there are about 60 million refugees in the world. I talked with the director of a resettlement agency the other day in St. Pete. He said that when he started 13 years ago, there were 10 million refugees, so you can see how much that has grown in the last decade. The second law that controls refugees is the Refugee Act of 1980. Now, what Congress intended by that was to set out a procedure by which refugees could come to the United States, and part of that was that the responsibility was placed directly on the President to determine how many refugees could come and where they would go. And one requirement that the President has is to consult with the states and the local governments and the private agencies before making that decision. And obviously the reason for that is they want to be sure there's work opportunity there in that particular area. They want to be sure that there's social services there and so forth. Now, the third law is the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, which basically says that federal law and the U.S. Constitution will have supremacy over the state law and the state constitution. The Supreme Court in 1941 held that immigration law is a federal matter, not a state matter. And you may remember the case in Arizona, the Arizona versus U.S., where the court reiterated that decision, that immigration law is controlled by federal law. Now, some states like Idaho have for years welcomed refugees into their state. They have mostly people from Africa, Asia, Middle East, and they have wanted refugees because they thought that that was a positive contribution to the workforce. But recently, they joined 31 states, which asked the administration to stop, at least temporarily, Syrian refugee resettlement because of security concerns. Florida was one of those states. It asked the same thing. But I think Florida has pretty well conceded that the federal government makes the decision as to where they're coming and if they can come at all. I don't think that Florida is anticipating a lawsuit in the area, but there have been a couple of lawsuits filed. Texas filed one just 3 months ago. They said that the president failed to consult with the states before placing them in the state of Texas, and as a result, that was a violation of the Refugee Act. Then, shortly thereafter, the state of Alabama filed a lawsuit with the same theory. The difference was this. The state of Alabama said, don't give us general information about who is coming. We want to see their specific files. We want to make an independent determination as to the security risk and as to the medical risk. So we even want their medical files. That case is still pending. Now, just last week, the Senate from Tennessee passed a resolution requiring the state of Tennessee to file a lawsuit of its own against the federal government. Now, that suit is going to be different. It's going to be based on the 10th Amendment, which says that the federal government has only powers delegated to it by the Constitution, and everything else is reserved to the state. And they are arguing this. In 2008, Tennessee opted out of the resettlement program, but the federal government continued to send people to be resettled there by naming a refugee coordinator and funding it with federal dollars. The problem, Tennessee says, is that that means that the taxpayers in Tennessee have to pick up the bills for social services for those people. So we'll see how that develops as well. Even if it's successful, a refugee can go anywhere they want to go. A refugee could be resettled in Massachusetts, but there's no prohibition of going to Tennessee to live and receive social benefits. Now, this is a fast developing area, and there has been different attempts other than to file lawsuits. The governor of Indiana put out an order saying that no funding would go for resettlement of Syrians in the state of Indiana. And just 4 days ago, a federal judge said that that was clearly discriminatory against Syrians and therefore was unlawful. There are 24 other states that have the same position, and that is they want to cut off funding for resettlement of Syrians, and we'll have to see. The federal judge in Indiana does not control any other state, so we'll see what happens on that. One last thought I'd like to leave with you, and that is there's a difference between a refugee and an asylee. A refugee is a person who leaves their home country, travels somewhere else, unable or unwilling to return to their home country because of a well-founded fear of persecution based on several categories, including political beliefs, religious beliefs, being part of a social group that's been discriminated against. But those people are outside of the country, and they are vetted when they come into the country. There are people, on the other hand, once you get to the United States, you can file an asylum application. And those people come legally, maybe through a visa, then they overstay and file an application, and they come illegally. Those people that come illegally are not vetted at all, unless they file an asylum application. But we know that a lot of people don't file asylum applications. Between 2012 and 2014, there were 5,280 Syrians who filed asylum applications, and about 2,000 were granted. But we know that some Syrians are coming across the southern border using fake passports, and some are caught and some are not caught. So hopefully I'll be happy to answer some questions at the end of the meeting, but I was given a strict limitation on the time I could speak, so hopefully this is a good overview of what's happening with Syrian law.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Our next speaker is Layla Abdelaziz. She is the Legislative and Government Affairs Director for the Florida Council on American Islamic Relations. Layla is responsible for advancing CARE's Florida mission and vision in Florida's municipal, county, and state governments. Her focus is to establish better understanding and stronger relationships between Florida's Muslim American community and the elected leaders who represent and serve them. Previously, she has served as Emerge USA's Tampa Bay Regional Director. Between 2011 and 2014, she held many roles at Emerge USA, where she managed the organization's Emerging Leaders Program and represented the Muslim American community in Tallahassee during legislative session. During her time in Tallahassee, Layla was able to develop a strong sense of awareness regarding Florida's political and governmental process and aims to apply this experience to better serve Florida's Muslim American community. In 2012, Layla was appointed to the city, by the City of Tampa Mayor Bob Buckhorn to serve on the City of Tampa Human Rights Board. And she prides herself in being a community organizer and is involved in various community and political organizations and campaigns. She enjoys reading and reflective writing and has been published in various states and national news outlets and publications. Born in Ramallah, Palestine, to a Palestinian father and a Russian mother, and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. Please welcome Layla Abdelaziz.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank the Manatee County Tiger Bay Club for having me and for hosting this very important conversation. It's very relevant to all of us as Americans. So I think that it's really interesting that we're having this conversation, particularly about Syrian refugees and whether the United States should welcome Syrian refugees or whether we should be concerned. And I kind of want to backtrack a little bit and go back to when we started having this conversation. As Americans, we saw this wave of governors and states and state members of Congress, U.S. senators, start attacking the status of Syrian refugees entering the United States after the tragedy in Paris. And why did this happen, right? Why was all of a sudden was there a concern that Syrian refugees are a risk to our national security here as Americans? Because that's what fundamentally this is about, right? Because as Floridians, as Americans, there are refugees that are resettled throughout the country from all over the world. And the majority of refugees that are resettled in Florida actually come from Latin America. Less than 5% of the refugees that were resettled in Florida between 2014 and 2015 were from Muslim-majority countries. And of that less than 5%, I think it was about 150 Syrians. So in the federal fiscal year of 2014 to 2015, there were 150 Syrians actually resettled in the United States. There have been about 2,000 Syrians resettled throughout the United States, and what we're seeing is these are Syrians with very dire medical needs, very dire medical concerns. But, this has become a political issue because what governors are saying, what members of Congress are saying, and what senators are saying is that we should be concerned about our national security, specifically because of Syrian refugees. Now, this goes back to Paris because there were reports that after the tragic attack in Paris, there was a Syrian refugee passport found in the ruins of the attacks. Since then, we have learned from European officials, from French officials, and from German officials that all perpetrators of the attacks in Paris were European nationals from France or Belgium. So it's very important to understand this distinction, that there were no Syrian refugees, according to official statements, according to the official investigations that have followed the Paris tragedies. There were no Syrian refugees involved in the tragic attacks in Paris. And yet, we're having a conversation about closing our borders to Syrian refugees. Refugees, Tom discussed the global refugee community, and it's tens of millions of people. The most conservative estimate says that there are 20 million global refugees throughout the world. A more liberal estimate says 30 to 40 million refugees throughout the world. But you know, since the Arab Spring and the conflict that has arisen in Syria, what you've seen is close to 11 million internally and externally displaced Syrians. You have 4 million Syrians that are displaced from their homeland. And I do want to reference that the majority of Syrians that have been displaced externally from Syria have actually gone into the border states in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq. This is where the majority, 3 million of the proposed 4 million refugees that have externally left Syria are actually in the neighboring countries. But there's hundreds of thousands of Syrians that are seeking refuge in Europe. And that poses the question, why are hundreds of thousands of people risking their lives, putting all of their money into this travel to get to Europe? Why is this happening? For several decades now, refugee camps throughout the Middle East have no longer become temporary settings for temporary political conflicts. What you have found now is that there are generations of refugees being born in refugee camps into very desolate spaces, no economic opportunities, no educational opportunities. Now you have an entire generation of Syrians that are being displaced because of the largest humanitarian crisis of our times. I mean, people agree with that politically across the board. This is the most dire humanitarian crisis that our generation is faced with in the 21st century. Syrians, because of the political carnage internally within Syria, you have an entire generation of young Syrians that have no educational opportunities, have lost their homes, have lost contact with their families, have absolutely no opportunity. So as we discuss the status of refugees, what we should also keep in mind is what is the status of attaining political stability in the Middle East so that we don't have to continue talking about the status of refugees globally. There is a concern, as 31 governors in 31 states have said, that Syrian refugees will threaten the national security of the United States. But no one is really talking about the status of a refugee visa entering the United States. So there's a global refugee population, and the UNHCR is the agency that's vetted by the international organization to vet refugees and define whether someone is a refugee or not. There is a very defined international definition of what it means to be a refugee. And by definition, refugees are people who are not protected by their government. That is why, under international treaties and international obligations, the international community has, since the 1940s, determined that because refugees are by default people that are not protected by their own governments, the international community has to step in and is obligated to step in to provide them with safety and protection from their governments that they're fleeing. So there's a very defined definition of what it means to be a refugee in the international level. And on top of the UNHCR vetting refugees and defining whether individuals are refugees or not, there are international treaties and international conventions. There's the 1951 convention, there's the 1967, I believe, the 1967 Protocol on Refugees, which the international community has signed on to international obligations as to how to define, how to help, and how to deal with refugees. Within the international law, refugees do have rights. They have rights to education, they have rights to travel documents, they have rights to not being sent back to the country that they're fleeing from, they have rights to not being persecuted for illegally entering a country. Because you might ask yourself, like, why is this happening? Why are hundreds of thousands of people, entering Europe? But there are actually rights that protect refugees and maintain that they're allowed to leave the countries that they're being persecuted from. Now, the United States internally as a country has its own domestic policies and its own domestic standards for accepting and resettling refugees. And we have what is really considered some of the highest standards for vetting and resettling refugees. The refugee visa to enter the United States as a refugee, the UNHCR makes a recommendation based on who they define as refugees, what countries will accept these refugees after the UNHCR determines that someone's a refugee. So the UNHCR has now recommended about 19,000 Syrian refugees that it thinks will pass the United States standards for resettling refugees. We have, again, resettled less than 2,000 since. So we're definitely seen by the global community as falling short to our international obligations to resettle refugees. But once a refugee is recommended by the UNHCR to the United States to be resettled here, there are about 5 federal law enforcement agencies that are involved in the vetting process. And firmly understood, the refugee visa is the most thorough screening process, is the most thorough visa status for any person that enters the United States. There are, the vetting process includes the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the FBI. These are all agencies that create a file on a refugee. They do background checks, they check their biometric data across international agencies, they do medical screenings, and Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees specifically have an even more enhanced screening process than all other refugees. So as a reminder, the majority of refugees that are entering the United States are not coming from Syria or Muslim majority countries, but what we are seeing now with the global conflicts of the past several decades, the majority of refugees in the global community are from Muslim majority countries. But because of our resettlement process. And what we've seen is actually the United States standards for screening and vetting refugees have gotten more thorough in the past several decades. At the height of the Bosnian War, which the Bosnian genocide created a global Bosnian refugee community of about 2 million people, and the United States resettled 150,000 individuals. So I know I went over my time. I really apologize. I really wanted to explain the process because there's this fear that refugees that are being resettled in the United States we don't know who they are, we don't know where they're coming from, and we don't know whether they are safe or not. These people are the foremost victims of war crimes, of terrorist activities, and loss of home. This is a global humanitarian concern. This is a global humanitarian crisis. And as Americans, we have a duty to resettle and open our borders to these individuals that are seeking opportunity, stability, and safety in the global community. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. Our third and final speaker today is Dr. Richard Swire. Richard is a 23-year Army veteran who retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1990. He was awarded the Legion of Merit for his years of service. Additionally, he was awarded 2 Bronze Stars with the V for Heroism in Ground Combat Operations, the Presidential Unit Citation, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Palm while serving with the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam. He is a graduate of the Field Artillery Officers Basic and Advanced Courses and the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Richard commanded 2 nuclear-capable field artillery units in Europe, served as adjutant for the 7th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and was responsible for anti-terrorism and terrorism counteraction doctrine while assigned to the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command in Fort Monroe, Virginia. Richard culminated his career as the Deputy Inspectoral General for U.S. Army Pacific Command, the Army Component Command for U.S. Forces Japan, U.S. Forces Korea, and Alaskan Command. Richard holds a doctorate of education from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, a master's degree in Management Information Systems from George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and a bachelor's degree in Fine Arts from Washington University in Missouri. Please welcome Dr. Richard Swire.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having us. I wanted to mention something that's not on my bio. I was also, when I was a Training and Doctrine Command, responsible. I was part of a commission that was put together, a presidential commission to look at how do we treat terrorists, and we came up with the policy that we will not negotiate with terrorists. That policy was implemented by President Ronald Reagan. I can tell you today we do not negotiate with terrorists. We lawyer them up, give them 3 hots and a cot, free medical care, and we're going to bring them to the United States of America. I have a personal interest in this topic because when I was in Germany commanding a young captain commanding an artillery unit, I was there during the 1972 attack on the Olympic Village in Munich. And that attack, a group called Black September, butchered 11 Israeli athletes and killed 1 German police officer. There was another group in Germany at the time called the Baader-Meinhof Gang. The Baader-Meinhof Gang was a Marxist-Leninist organization that was kidnapping American soldiers' children. They were assassinating German politicians, and they were robbing banks and killing police officers. Both of those organizations, Black September and the Baader-Meinhof Gang, were trained by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They were trained in Jordan and in Gaza. I want to clarify something. We're not talking about refugees. Let's take a look at Europe. I think Europe is what can happen here in the United States of America, and it actually is happening in the United States of America. What we are seeing in Europe is not a refugee crisis, it is a migration. It is a Muslim migration. It is a Muslim migration. Why? Because the Arabic calendar begins with what? It begins on the day, not with the date that Muhammad was born. It begins with the date that Muhammad migrated from Mecca to Medina. And when he migrated from Mecca to Medina, he picked up the sword and he conquered the entire Arabic peninsula, driving out all the Christians and Jews. That is why it's a migration. You do not have 3, 4, 5 million people move north without it being properly planned, organized. You have documents being created that are false. We had one British journalist walk right into Turkey, and within 72 hours, he had complete documentation, Syrian passport and identification papers. He was a Syrian migrant. I disagree. Those who carried out the Paris attack may not have been Syrians, but they were soldiers of Allah. They belonged to the Islamic State. They were saboteurs for the Islamic State. Why did they attack on Friday, November the 13th? They attacked on Friday, November the 13th, because in 1917, that is the date, November the 13th, that the Allied forces reoccupied Constantinople, which was the end of the Ottoman Empire Caliphate. Ladies and gentlemen, they don't do something on a whim. Now, we talk about 5 agencies vet quote-unquote refugees, but they're not refugees, they're migrants. Let's look at the family from San Bernardino. Young woman, mother with a child, was vetted by 5 agencies, the same 5 agencies we talked about: CIA, FBI, Homeland Security. Wrong address. She falsified the address on her visa request. She falsified a number of documents. Why wasn't she sent back? Because of her ethnicity. That's the problem. We mentioned the 1980 Act, called the Refugee Act. Of course, it was created by former Senator Ted Kennedy and former Senator Joe Biden, signed by Jimmy Carter. Of course, it was Jimmy Carter who, during the Iran hostage crisis, deported, had every one of over 50,000 Iranians in the United States of America report to the local visa office, had them screened, and he personally ordered the deportation of 20,000 of them. We talk about who is making the decision. Tom said it was the president. It's not actually the president that makes the decision who's coming here. It's the United Nations, as was mentioned, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So the president isn't even involved. He just gets, oh, we're going to send these people to you. And by the way, since the, quote, Syrian conflict in 2011, the United States, we the taxpayers in this room, sent that organization $4.5 billion. Oh, by the way, the top 5 welcoming states for these refugees, number 3 is Florida. Ladies and gentlemen, there are 190 refugee resettlement centers in America. 27 of them are in the state of Florida. That's over 10%. What does that tell you? By the way, there are, why are there 9 agencies, major agencies, not NGOs, that are doing this? It's the money, ladies and gentlemen. Each one of these agencies, of which 6, by the way, are faith-based, are all getting big dollars to resettle these people. And who is asking for them? Big business. But anybody ever eat Chobani yogurt? Buy Chobani yogurt? Big, it's not even a U.S. company. And they're bringing these refugees. I just want to thank you. I'm looking forward to your questions. I think I hopefully enlighten you in a little bit about what's going on. And again, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Swire. At this point, we'll move on to our section of open questions for Tiger Bay members. For those of you that are not Tiger Bay members, or for those of you that might be visiting today, during this section of the program, we open the floor up for Tiger Bay members to ask direct questions to one, two, or all of today's presenters. If you are here today and you are not a Tiger Bay member, but you have a burning question that you would absolutely love to ask, you are more than welcome to do so, as we always joke, for the bargain price of a $100 Tiger Bay membership, which you can apply for with our 2 lovely young ladies at the table over there. So that being said, at this time we'll move forward with the questions, first being Becky Kness. Oh, also, sorry, Becky.
Sure.
One new item that we have introduced this year is that you will have 30 seconds to state your question. The board felt that any thorough question can probably be done in 30 seconds. We want to remind everyone that you are not here to make political statements or give opinions. You are simply here to ask a distinct question. So I have a little 30-second timer that will start for everyone that hopefully we'll never hear beep at all today. So that being said, Becky, welcome. Thank you.
Becky Kness, and I'm on the board of the Tiger Bay Club. And I'd like to ask Layla if you could respond to some of the statements that have been made that you were shaking your head about, to be sure we have points of view with clarity and understanding.
Absolutely. Yes. So, you know, it's very important in times of fear and frustration to not conflate things. The San Bernardino attackers, the wife of the individual that committed this very tragic and horrendous thing. She entered the United States under a fiancé visa. She was not a refugee. She was not vetted thoroughly by the refugee resettlement process. She actually entered as a fiancé visa receiver, and this goes back to questions and problems that the United States has been talking about for the past 30 years about not updating our immigration policies, which we must and we should, but we just don't have a willing Congress. Another thing, so literally public information documents, you can get these readily online. State of Florida, 2014, 2015 entrance of refugees in the state. There were 48,000 refugees that were resettled in Florida, 46,000 of them from Cuba, 104 from Syria. This is these are facts. This is not my opinion, and it's not a political statement. And concerning migration and defining the individuals that are in Europe as migrants or refugees, we've heard this conversation, we've heard this debate. So there is a particular definition of what a refugee is, and it is not millions of people leaving the Middle East to Europe. It is, at the most liberal estimate, 700,000. Again, the majority of the refugee crisis, the refugee community is being absorbed by the border states in the region where there's this political carnage going on. And I think what we have to ask ourselves is, if such a high wave of immigrants, of refugees are leaving the Middle East to Europe, it is because they are facing political carnage at home. It is because of unresolved conflicts. The United States, we sell our weapons to Arab countries. We are one of the largest weapon dealers to these countries in the Middle East. We have bombed 7 Muslim-majority countries during the Obama administration. We have bombed 17 Muslim-majority countries since the 1970s. We are in the longest period of war as the United States that we have ever been in the history of our country. And so it's much easier to say they are the problem because of who they are than it is to reflect on our domestic and foreign policies that unfortunately have had a lot to do with the realities and the challenges and the political carnage of the Middle East today. I could go on for a long time, but thank you for asking that question.
We'll also let Dr. Swire have a brief counterpoint as well.
Thank you very much. I just want to quote what U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said on February 13th. He characterized the flood of refugees entering Europe as a, quote, threat of near existential proportions to the continent. A threat of near existential proportions. Sweden is deporting 80,000. Finland is deporting 20,000. The Balkan states are closing their borders. There are refugee camps migrant camps in France that are burning as we speak. By their own people. The migrants are burning their own camp. So this is not a pretty picture. If we ignore it, if we don't see what's happening in Europe, and we ignore it and we try to wash over it as if it's some wonderful humanitarian thing we're doing, of course, we all know that the 2 Central American teens charged in the recent execution-style killing of a Massachusetts man came to the U.S. as unaccompanied alien children. Ladies and gentlemen, this is happening right here in the United States of America. Thank you.
Pat Benson, member, Tiger Bay. I think my question that I was going to bring up, you had mentioned, Dr. Swire, that a woman came into this country and her documents were not correct and she wasn't sent back. Can you tell me what you know about this woman? Why wasn't she sent back? Was it the San Diego?
Yeah.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, my good friend Philip Haney was a federal agent for the Department of Homeland Security. Philip has a new book coming out, and I don't want to be plugging a book, but it's called See Something, Say Nothing. If you go to the Department of Homeland Security website, there's a big banner on there. It says, if you see something, say something. That works for nobody in the federal government, because if they see something, they're told not to say something. Philip's going to wrote the book. It's going to be coming out. You can pre-order it. He knew about what was going on in San Bernardino. He knew about what was going on before the Boston Marathon bombing. He knew about what was happening in various, he actually received a commendation for stopping 300 terrorist attacks. Under this administration, he was told not to do his job. He was told stop. He was told to destroy 100 files plus of known terrorists in the United States of America. Why? Because of political correctness. Political correctness kills. It killed in San Bernardino. It almost killed a police officer in Philadelphia. This is a serious problem. Now, fear-mongering is not the issue. The issue is reality. I don't care. I'm not here to bring fear. I'm just saying, read your headline. See what is happening in the news. See what's happening in cities throughout the United States. And when you see that, don't ignore it, like the people in the neighbors in San Bernardino who saw very suspicious activity. And when the police interviewed them, the police asked, why didn't you say something? You saw it, why didn't you say? They didn't want to be called racist. They could have saved 14 lives, 21 injured. Thank you.
We'll give Layla a chance to have a brief counterpoint, and then we'll take a question from Misty.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Misty Servia, and okay, yes.
And so again, I'd like to go back to the issue that we're here to discuss, which is refugee resettlement. And again, these are facts that you can look up. Since September 11th, 2001, the United States has resettled 784,000 refugees. And exactly 3 have been arrested for planning terrorist activities. That percentage is 0.000004%. We absolutely have to be concerned about our national security, about our safety, about being thorough. When you work on policy, when you work with law enforcement agencies, and when you work with protecting our borders, there is no clarity. You can never, ever assume that there is one solution that will fix all problems, but rather than us addressing the roots of these problems, we are spreading, unfortunately, very bigoted and xenophobic rhetoric about individuals and people that are the primary victims of terrorism. And, this is, so according to experts, Americans' annual risk of being killed by a terrorist is 1 in 3.5 million. Just to give you some context on that, Americans are more likely to die in an accident involving a bathtub, 1 in 950,000, a home appliance, 1 in 1.5 million, a deer, 1 in 2 million, or in a commercial airline, 1 in 2.9 million. We have to be concerned about our security, absolutely, but we cannot risk our civil rights, our civil liberties, and humanitarian causes which make us uniquely American in order to divide our communities and create paranoia that history has taught us time and time again does not reap any benefits to anyone.
Thank you. My name is Misty Servia. I am a member of Tiger Bay, and my husband is a Cuban refugee, and he and his family came here decades ago, and I have heard all the stories of how he and his family had very difficult situations in their neighborhoods and in their schools because there were comparisons drawn to criminals who were from Cuba. In fact, I think there was even a movie, Scarface, about that same time that kind of illustrated that. So my question is, are there similarities between the Syrian refugees and the Cuban refugees, or is this a completely different situation? I would like it to be to Layla and Dr. Swire, please.
So again, there's like 5 typical classifications that determine whether someone is a refugee or not. And the majority of, as far as I understand, I could be incorrect, but the majority of Cuban refugees that are still to this day being resettled in the United States are fleeing political persecution and not loss of home, violence, terrorism, radicalism. Syrians currently in Europe, of these hundreds of thousands that are in Europe, have lost their homes, literally, have lost their families, are facing daily threats to their safety, to their security, to the security of their children. If you watch international journalists are at the borders of these countries interviewing these individuals, and people are pleading for Europe to just take the children. They're willing to sacrifice their lives to get their children to the borders of these European states and say and under these international protocols that I think over 140 countries have signed since the 1960s, refugees have rights. They have rights to education. They have rights to not be returned to the home that they're coming from. And to Dr. Swire's point about documentation and being able to get documentation that is not authentic. This is happening. And this is happening because one of the rights of a refugee is to be given travel documents and travel IDs. But this is such a huge problem that Europe is facing a very different crisis than the United States because Europe is geographically connected to the conflict region. And we definitely do not have the systems in place. This is the whole problem in Europe. This is the conflict because it's such a surge in refugee migration to Europe. But when refugees are not given the travel documents that are their rights according to international law and international treaties, of course there's going to be a black market. Of course there's going to be criminals. I mean, there's criminals in Sarasota County, in case you didn't know. There's criminals in the most developed nations in the world, and there will be criminals in any human population. But what we have to do as the international community, as the United States, is solve the roots of these problems and allow these individuals the opportunity to find safe haven in either the developed world or the opportunity to go back to their homes safely. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. My family came, my grandfather was from, went to medical school in Ukraine, got his degree in medicine from Kiev University. And my mother's family came from Poland. So I am a first-generation American. Have you ever heard a Polish joke? I've heard a lot of Polish jokes when I was going to school. Okay, let me just give you the magnitude of what we're talking about here. It is important to understand that what we're seeing in this migration, and we keep saying Syrian, we don't know these are Syrians. We found in Europe that there are many, the Islamic State is churning out fake passports. We know Turkey is churning out fake passports. There's an industry. We don't know these people are Syrian. They're Iraqis, they're Pakistanis, they're from Lebanon, they're from Libya. They're not Syrian. Okay? Now, you pointed out there were actually two countries. You said there were more than that, but it's really Turkey and Jordan that are really taking these people in. Well, there's 55 other Islamic countries, part of the 57 Organization of Islamic Cooperation, that could take these refugees, quote unquote. They aren't. Why? Because they know what they bring with them. Let me just give you, if you think it's bad now, there was an interview with Forbes magazine and Klaus Schwab, who is the founder of the World Economic Forum. The interview was done in Davos, Switzerland. I don't know if you noticed, but the gas prices have been going down. There are some places where it costs more for the barrel than the oil in the barrel, okay? That means that they're getting less revenue, particularly in those Middle Eastern nations that depend on oil for their revenue. Mr. Schwab, again, founder of the World Economic Forum, predicts that if oil prices, quote, If oil prices continue to drop, 1 billion Muslims will migrate to the north from the Middle East and North Africa. There are serious concerns by individual citizens. We talked about 3 lawsuits. Thomas talked about 3 lawsuits. There's also a lawsuit that was filed by Walter Bryan Bilbrough, who is a husband and father too. He filed a lawsuit naming Governor Nikki Haley, the South Carolina Department of Social Services, Lutheran Services, and the World Relief Fund of Spartanburg as co-defendants. The allegations of the lawsuit seek equitable and other relief to stop the state's 2016 refugee resettlement plan. There are people concerned in America for good reasons. I am not here to say that there aren't people that deserve to come here, but it is not a refugee has no right to come here. They have an obligation, if they're accepted, to integrate and become part of the fabric of America. That is not what we're seeing in Europe, and that's not what we're seeing in significant areas in the United States of America. Thank you.
Mr. Minor, feel free to go ahead, and then we probably have room for one more question after that. So if you've got one that's really on your mind that you'd like to say, now's the time to rush the mic.
Hi, I'm Dave Watchdog Minor. I'm a member of Tiger Bay. My question is directed to all 3, but I'd like Mr. Goldman to first respond to it. I understand that Dr. Swire earlier made reference to what I think he described as resettlement agencies, and indicated that in our country we have something like 190 resettlement agencies, and 27 of them here in Florida. And he made mention that there is, so companies become this, and the tone of what he was saying was maybe it really isn't working the way taxpayers would like to have it work. And so my question is, what is the role of resettlement agencies? What auditing do we have of these resettlement agencies? And I add to that, it seems like I read sometime in the last couple months that there was some abuse of public money with respect to resettlement agencies. And is this directed to refugees, or is it broader than refugees? So thank you.
Thank you for your question. Basically, the states handle resettlement in different ways. The state of Florida, for example, has the Department of Children and Families take money from the federal government, and then the state agency distributes that to the different resettlement agencies. There are states like the one that I mentioned with Tennessee, and there are 11 other states that are part of the Wilson Fish alternative program, where they designate a refugee coordinator, which is not part of the state. They're funded by the federal government, and they distribute the federal money. So, and then there are others that are dealing just between private-public partnerships. So it depends on which state you're in as to how that money is actually distributed. But as I mentioned, in Florida, because it takes money directly from the federal government to the state agency, they're the ones that have to do the auditing. They're the ones that monitor the way that the money is handled and the resettlement procedures for the different resettlement agencies. So it's a cooperative situation. If I could comment, I will make one comment on this idea of the migration. Whether or not a person is a migrant or refugee is a legal question. And as was mentioned before, to be a refugee, you have to leave your home country and fit into a certain category of persecution. And typically, that is by the state or by a state-sponsored person or agency like a police department and so forth. We have migrants coming here from Latin America, obviously. And those people, when they come here to be with their family or they come for economic reasons, they are migrants, they're not refugees, unless they file an asylum application and they can prove that they meet the legal standard that they have been persecuted by a state government or country or the police department or the army. So that's the way that they do that. That's why everybody that comes here cannot stay. Now, because of lack of enforcement, that's why we have such an immigration problem here. The lack of enforcement at the border to let people in from all over the place. We know that, for example, until recently, a person from anywhere in the world could go to Bolivia with no visa at all. Once they get to Bolivia, they could get to Central America and then make their way to the southern border, and then many of them were not caught. So there are many ways to get here, and those people that come as migrants are supposed to be sent back. But we have a broken system in this sense that even if they come here, now they don't run from the border agents. They just simply say, we're from Central America, and we want to file for an asylum. And they will be given court papers to go to court. Half of them show up, half of them don't. Those people that don't show up are the ones that I think are as dangerous or more dangerous than the people that come through the State Department and through the UN, because there's absolutely no vetting process for those people. The one thing I will say, too, even if they're ordered deported, many of them don't go home. We have no enforcement to make them go home, just like we do have courts. We do participate in those court trials, and many of them are issued orders, but it doesn't mean that they're going anywhere. Okay. Thank you.
Let me just say one moment, take one moment, because I'm glad that Thomas mentioned the idea of a migrant. Anyone can migrate to the United States. We've seen that happen. We've actually seen children. You may have seen pictures of trains with children on the top of them coming from South America across the border. Families literally sending their children. There was no persecution. They just wanted to get the kids to America by the tens of thousands. I just want you to remind you that 23 years ago, this has been going on for quite a while. 23 years ago, there was a gentleman named Mahmoud Abu Halima, who was here on a 6-month visa as a tourist, which expired. Luckily for him, Congress was preparing to authorize an amnesty program for 1 million illegal aliens, and he applied for amnesty in 1986. He received temporary legal status in 1988, became a permanent resident 2 years later, became a taxi driver in the great city of New York, and was the gentleman who drove the van into the World Trade Center in 1993 and tried to topple it from the parking lot in the garage. Thank you.
Judith.
Hi, I'm Judy Sedgman. I am a member of Tiger Bay. I have no personal expertise in the population of which we speak, except that I know 3 people of Syrian citizenship personally as their teacher at West Virginia University, where I was a professor in the School of Medicine. And the one thing I did find out from getting to know them very well is that they had a tremendous love of their country. They were studying in the United States, and they came to West Virginia because it is a very poor state, a lot of rural, underserved populations. They felt that they could bring that knowledge back to their country and be of great service. And they often would show slides and pictures of how beautiful this country was. It was just so incredibly beautiful. And they would say, please come and visit us. Syria is such a friendly place, and so on. So that was my only impression of Syria until all of this recent events. I'm asking you this, Dr. Swire, as the leaders of the free world, which the United States likes to think that we are, don't we have some obligation to have a higher vision for solving this problem on a human level than simply, yes, of course, we have to protect our security, but what is our leadership role then to address what I perceive to be human beings who would have rather stayed in this beautiful country from which they came?
Wire.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we've done, as you pointed out, we've done a magnificent job of bringing people here to the United States of America since our inception. I mean, we have never, with few exceptions, we've actually created, we've had an amnesty program, as I mentioned. We legalized over 1 million people just overnight. We are the most giving, caring, loving nation in the world. That's why people want to come here. The question becomes, would it be better for them to stay in their home country and take back their home? I would want to stay in my home and take back my home. Look, this conflict in the Middle East has been going on for 1,400 years. 1,400 years. Shia versus Sunni. Alawite versus Shia versus Sunni versus Persian versus what. And we have been wonderful, opened up our arms. Europe has opened up its arms. The West is part of the Christian, the Judeo-Christian belief system. Loving, come. The problem happens when they don't assimilate, when they don't become an American. There's a wonderful, a friend of mine, Nidra Paula, lives in Paris. She's Jewish. She's fearful. 700 no-go zones in France. That's areas where you cannot, the police can't even go. Controlled by, anyway. France opened its arms to the Algerians. And the Algerians went to France. But when they went to France, they brought Algeria with them. And they created a state within a state. That's untenable. You cannot have a state within a state. And so that's the problem we face.
With all due respect, sir, that really wasn't my question. My question, I agree with you. People would prefer to stay at their
absolutely, and they want to.
Homes.
Actually, they want to.
My question was, how do we take leadership as a nation?
Well, we're going to have to change leadership in order to take leadership. I don't want to get political, but the only way we can take leadership is to change leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. We will wrap up today. I have appointed our illustrious Vice President, Chris Wiley, to secretly choose who he thought was the most engaging and informative question for the day to award the Tiger by the Tail award to. So, Chris, who do you have for today?
It's tough, but Pat Pitt.
All right. We will have to catch Pat in the parking lot, or else if anyone knows the dentist she is at, maybe we can go find that dentist. I just want to remind you that we are in the midst of our membership drive. We have individual memberships for $100, nonprofit memberships for $200, and corporate memberships for $300. Most importantly, I just want to remind you that beginning next month, we are scheduling our Tiger Bay meetings to the third Thursday of the month so that we can be a little more facilitating to our other Tiger Bay members to the south and the north and not compete with one another. So please mark your calendars for Thursday, April 21st, I'm sorry, right here at Pier 22. Our topic will be impact fees, a fair revenue generator, or an affordable housing killer, which should prove to be an extremely fun topic to hit. So thank you all for coming today. Have a wonderful afternoon, have a wonderful weekend, and go Pirates.